And if heretics will corrupt the morals of men by introducing and propagating idolatry and superstition, which are procurative of God's judgments and subversive of the good of civil society, why may not God's ministers punish the same, according to his own holy law? And how could a king's using his utmost influence by all lawful means to defend and promote the covenanted uniformity of the Church of Scotland make him a religious tyrant, or guilty of invading the kingdom of another prince? If both magistrates and people would learn from the divine law to be of one mind and to speak the same thing, there would be no such difficulty in effecting a religious uniformity as is often pretended. And at any rate, it is our duty to pray that, as there is but one shepherd, there may be but one sheepfold, and that, as the Lord is one, so his worship may be one among all the nations. What does Mr. H. mean by what he calls the sacred rights of mankind, of conscience, and of private judgment? Does he think that a right to profess any sort of worship which the corrupt fancy of men is pleased to invent, or to set up rulers contrary to the express precept of God's law, is a sacred right? All rights that can be properly called sacred, relative to true religion, or the interests thereof, are purchased by Christ to his church and people. But it would be blasphemy to assert that he purchased a liberty to profess or practice any mode of worship contrary to the second precept of his own law. Mr. H. surely knows that the law of God alone, and neither the conscience nor fallible judgment of man, is our supreme and only infallible rule, and that whatever principle or practice is contrary to this law is truly sinful, whether our conscience and judgment approve of it or not. These faculties of the soul are God's creatures and servants that ought to be employed daily for his glory. But being now corrupted by sin, they cannot do their duty until they be renewed and informed by his holy law. And in proportion to the knowledge which the Christian has of this law, his judgment and conscience will act right or wrong. But to set up these as the alone rule of our duty, is at once to exalt the will of the sinful creature above the will of his all-perfect Creator, and to suppose that this law is only a rule as understood by the judgment and conscience of men, is plainly to divest it of its intrinsic divine authority, and to allow these faculties a superiority over God in giving a regulating authority to his word, according to the erroneous sense which they put on it. But how long will an erring conscience make it innocent in a man to believe, profess, and practice heresy or idolatry more than theft, murder, or adultery? And as the law of God directs our judgment and conscience in our other actions, so also in setting up civil rulers, supreme and subordinate, to act for his glory, the good of his church, and the interest of civil society at large. And if no respect is to be paid to this law in these matters, then it is of no consequence that principles of religion we profess, or what kind of rulers we choose to protect these principles, which would open the door to the prevailing system of deism and infidelity. According to this loose scheme, Mohammedans, papists, and deists ought all to be encouraged by the civil magistrate as God's minister, as much as the strictest observer of the divine law, and those who trample on the laws of Jehovah ought to be equally rewarded with acts of royal favor and admitted into places of power and trust as the best friends to the constitution of heaven. And a pagan or a Roman Catholic may be a lawful king over a Christian reformed land, as well as a brother by nation and religion. And then it will be no longer a crime for vile men to be in high place. Mr. H. professes, quote, that he would be sorry to see His Majesty's power exerted to crush these poor people, as they are only a handful of misled men, and not likely to increase, unquote. If they were all honest and right-hearted men as they ought to be, they need not be dejected by slavish fear on account of the power of men and devils, as 28 years of cruel persecution could not crush the professors of the selfsame cause in the last century, and the power of God is as able to protect as ever. They are indeed but a handful, and a despised handful too. But they are as numerous as the disciples of Christ in the days of his flesh, and towards the conclusion of Antichrist's reign, it is probable that they will be fewer still. But if they be honored to be faithful, to keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus, they pay little respect to the smallness of their number, or to the reproach of men on that account. And although they be reckoned misled men, they wish to walk in good company, and are studying through grace, to follow the approved footsteps of those who, through faith and patience, are now inheriting the promises, and like them are testifying against the prevailing evils of the times in individuals, families, churches, and civil states. Their scheme is not indeed likely to increase much under prelatic and Erastian constitutions. They think it a great matter if they can hold fast that which they have. But when Christ comes conquering, and to conquer, he can soon make the greatest mountains to become a plain, and, whatever this author may insinuate, there is nothing in these principles contrary to true Christian liberty, which alone includes that spiritual freedom wherewith Christ has made his church and people free. However, as a conclusion to this paragraph, if Mr. H. had rightly considered the nature, use, and ends of magistracy as an ordinance of God for promoting his own glory and the best interests of men, he would not have accounted scriptural and covenant qualifications sinful conditions. And this is the substance of what the R.P. contend for on the head of civil government. In page 186, Mr. H. assigns what he calls the foundation of the Reformed Presbytery's erroneous notions about the power of the Christian magistrate, which he says, quote, lies in their ignorance and misconceptions of the proper distinctions between the ancient Israelitish commonwealth and the evangelical kingdom, unquote. It is no wonder that he considers the Reformed Presbytery as ignorant on this head, when our honored reformers themselves are represented by him in the same point of view. But does he really think that the gospel dispensation has abrogated any moral precept, or freed from the performance of any moral duty that has a tendency to promote the glory of God and the interest of religion in the world? Or is anything abrogated under the gospel except the ceremonial law and such parts of the judicial law as were immediately connected therewith? And is not the moral law as a rule of life, and every ordinance and duty thereof as obligatory under the gospel as it was under the Jewish dispensation? If Mr. H. would only condescend to examine this subject seriously, he would readily find that after the rejection of the theocracy under Samuel, there was no such difference between the Jewish magistracy and that of Christian countries as is often pretended. The Jewish magistracy was an ordinance of God. Magistracy is still an ordinance of God to be submitted to for the Lord's sake. The Jewish magistrates were God's deputies and ministers. Christian magistrates lawfully constituted are still powers ordained by God and ministers of God for good, to whom we must be subject for conscience sake. The revealed will of God was the proper statute book of the civil law of the Jews. The will of God revealed in Scripture is still the supreme standard of all civil laws among Christians, on which they ought to be founded, and by which their moral obligation is circumscribed. And the Jewish magistrates were ordained to promote the welfare of the church, that they might thereby promote the welfare of the state in subserviency to the glory of God, the King of the nation. Christian magistrates are still bound to do the same as they have opportunity. Deuteronomy 16, verses 18 and 19, Romans 13, verses 1 and 6, Psalm 82, verses 1 and 6, Isaiah 49, verses 23 and 60, 3, 10, and 16, Acts 4, verse 19, as well as look at Brown on toleration, pages 60 and 61. It has never yet been proven that the R.P. ever required the civil magistrate to punish any, either by capital or corporal punishment, who had not subjected themselves thereto by the open violation of God's law, this law requiring them to be so punished. But if idolatry be as inimical to the interests of civil society as theft, forgery, or robbery, why may not God's ministers punish the former as well as the latter according to his own law? And it is truly mournful that a professed Presbyterian should have copied after the sectarian distinctions between the ancient Israelitish commonwealth and the evangelical kingdom, as Mr. H. has evidently done after that noted independent John Glass, who renounced Presbytery both in name and thing. And here a footnote. Compare Glass's testimony on the King of Martyrs with Mr. Hutcheson's dissertation. After having discussed his grounds of surprise and displayed his wit a little, Mr. H. comes in, page 211 and 212, to exhibit another charge against what he calls the Cameroonian Church, quote, because they, along with the secession, have in their writings declared themselves enemies to toleration, unquote. They indeed do testify against all authoritative toleration of false worship, as the members of the Westminster Assembly have done before them. Confession, chapter 23, section 3, and Larger Catechism, question 109, which Mr. H. would readily declare his solemn approbation of at the time of his ordination. And how he can reconcile that solemn declaration with his loose tenets published in the World to the world, on toleration and what he calls the sacred rights of conscience is difficult to say, and can only be ascribed to his superior knowledge of the rights of private judgment. One thing is certain, that in the whole of his dissertation he has not produced a single text of Scripture to prove that magistrates, as God's ministers, have a right to encourage or protect men in blaspheming his holy name and in their rebellious and treacherous acting against his glory by their idolatrous and superstitious worship of him, and thereby introducing the most accursed and damnable errors into the church, or that they ought to give Satan and his agents as much countenance and assistance in drawing men to hell as they give to Christ and his faithful servants in conducting them in the plain path to heaven. It is true indeed that universal toleration is held in high esteem among modern infidels and lukewarm professors, but it evidently includes a great absurdity in the very nature of it, for the religion of Jesus needs no such favor of man, because its freedom has been bought by the precious blood of Christ, and therefore has an intrinsic right to a proper establishment wherever Christianity reaches. This religion is but one, as God is one, and his law is one, and it is really amazing that the professed ministers of God would arrogate to themselves a power which God himself has not. It is inconsistent with the holy nature of God to give an authoritative toleration to the least evil. And, since he cannot do it, it must be very presumptuous for sinful mortals to attempt it. And, considering the magistrate's power to flow from the people, acting according to the divine law in his investiture, he cannot employ it for the toleration of error, as no people can communicate a right to a magistrate which they have not themselves, and no society of people on earth has a right to profess any one article of faith that is not contained in or agreeable to the Holy Scriptures. For if men may add one human invention to the worship of God, they may add 20. And if they may act contrary to the law of God in one case without sin, they may do so in 1,000 cases. But he that is unfaithful in a little is unfaithful also in much, and he that offendeth in one point is guilty of all. The precious truths of Christ are not to be separated according to the vain fancy of sinful creatures, as they all flow from the same divine authority, and are all so many parts of the great whole, which, like Christ's seamless coat, cannot be divided without spoiling their beauty. Since then there is but one Lord, one faith, and one baptism, and as the dove and undefiled of Christ is but one, Ephesians 4:5, Song of Solomon 6:9, there can be no room left for an authoritative toleration of false modes of worship expressly forbidden by God's law. The preceding observations may show that the principles of the Reformed Presbytery are by no means so absurd as Mr. H. represents them. If impartially examined, it will be found that they contain nothing but what has an obvious tendency to promote the glory of God, the interests of true religion, and the general good of mankind. And let all the intelligent and religious part of men say, if it were not to be a desirable event to see church and state firmly united on a proper constitution, in receiving, observing, and keeping pure and entire all such religious worship and ordinances as God hath appointed in his word. And what do the R.P. ask more? Now, since they are persuaded that their principles include all the good things that are to be found in the principles of the different religious denominations that exist respecting doctrine, worship, discipline, and government, as these are revealed in the law of God, why should they be blamed for testifying and protesting against public deeds which they see to be plainly contrary to the Scriptures of truth, and invidiously reproached because they cannot take any active part with a corrupt society which has made the maintenance and support of prelatic and Erastian principles an essential condition of their constitution, contrary to the second commandment of the moral law?